What's going on, guys? This is Jan coming from you from the Arcane Lighthouse, bringing another deck profile in EDH for Magic the Gathering. Today we're going to be focusing on Anafenza, the Foremost. So she's a 3 CMC, 1 green, 1 black, and 1 white. And whenever she attacks, you put a +1 counter on another target tapped creature you control. And if a creature would be put into an opponent's graveyard, you exile it instead. And it's a 4/4. Overall, very great commander. In terms of control, your opponent's graveyard definitely stops decks like Carador and Cedrus, the Trader King. So grave base is very difficult for your opponents to handle, and if you cover your spots outside of creatures and just exile your opponent's instant sorceries, they can't flash back or do any shenanigans while they're in the graveyard. So going right through it, we're going to go through some staples in terms of creatures. So we have 1 Vorinclex, double mana while freezing your opponent's mana sources. We have 1 Elish Norn, double basically +2/+2 for your creatures, and essentially -2/-2 for your opponent's creatures. We have 1 Shieldred. Definitely, your opponent has to sacrifice a creature at the beginning of their upkeep, and you return a creature card from your graveyard at your upkeep as well. We have 1 Massacre Worm. I like this card because it's a nice deck tech because essentially as soon as it enters the battlefield, your opponent's creatures get -2/-2, and every time a creature would be put into your opponent's graveyard, you get they lose 2 life for each of those creatures. So definitely a good board wipe if you're facing like a token deck or weak weenie creatures that your opponent puts out. Next thing, we have a Necropolis Regent. So essentially this card is really good because whenever a creature you control deals damage, you put that many +1/+1 counters on that creature. So definitely you would either double its power, if not get some kind of bonus from every creature attacking. So you buff up your creatures every turn if you can. We have 1 Sun Titan. You get a CMC of 3 out of your graveyard in terms of a permanent. Every time it attacks or enters the battlefield, so great for flicker effects, definitely great for when it just attacks in general. Next card, we have Juniper Order Ranger. So anytime a creature would enter the battlefield under your control, you put a +1 counter on that creature and Juniper as well. So definitely it's a good trigger effect. Definitely stacks really well if you have multiple creatures entering the battlefield at one time, and you have different enchantments such as Hardening Scales and all that stuff. It definitely will stack very quickly, and your opponent will be facing like a 6/6, 6/7 power creature that was originally like a 1/1 or a 2/1, and it would just get out of hand if they don't have a response to it. Next, we have Archangel of Thune, lifelink flying. Whenever you gain life, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Another card that because it's lifelink, it's automatically a shoo-in that you're going to be connecting in terms of like because it has evasion. And if your opponent does not have flying, they're taking 3 to the face, and all your creatures get +1/+1. We have 1 Karametra. So overall, indestructible, as long as your devotion is green and white, is less than 7. It's not a creature, but if you do, it's a 6/7. And whenever you cast a creature, you search for a Plains or Forest card. You search for your dual land, your your shock land. So very good ramp, especially if that's what you expect from green. Next, we have Ivory Tusk Fortress. So untap all creatures that have a +1/+1 counter during each of your opponent's untap step. So definitely, it gets out of hand. It's very great incentive if you have to put more +1 counters on each creature. That way, you can always defend, assault your opponent the next turn, and then defend again once it's their another opponent's turn. That way, you're never vulnerable. And you always have a line of defense just in case you go all in on one opponent just to bring their life down. Next card is a personal favorite of mine, Skithrix, the Blight Dragon. So it's flying, infect, you can give it haste, and you can regenerate it. So the great thing about this card is it's in flying, it also has infect, and that way you can actually cause it to connect for almost 4 damage. So that way you can actually make it so that they have basically a ticking time clock on how long they will survive. Because if this connects more than 2 times, that opponent is dead from infect counters. Next, we're going to move along to Solemn Simulacrum. So essentially, it's a 2/2. Whenever it enters the battlefield, you gain a life. You put it on the battlefield tapped, and when it dies, you draw a card. All right, next card we have is going to be a Corpse Jack Menace. So if a +1 counter would be put on another creature you control, that put twice that many counters, so essentially doubling the counters. So great in terms of, essentially its name, Corpse Jack Menace, just jacking up your guys to a ridiculous amount. Next card, we have Creekwood Leech. Other black creatures and green creatures, you get +1/+1/+1, depending on their colors. And then at the beginning of their upkeep, you get a 1/1 black-green Worm token. So essentially, it's automatically going to be a 3/3, and you get it every turn. So if your opponents, it's another thing that your opponents need to stop before it gets out of hand. Next card, we have Hero Bladehold. So whenever it has Battle Cry, so all your creatures, whenever it attacks, it gets +1/0, and when it attacks, you get 2 1/1 white creature tokens tapped and attacking. So very great for token generation and very good for aggro and offensive tactics in terms of very early game. So that way you can hit for damage really early, especially if you have like equipment such as like different swords, Sword of the Animist, ramp, etc. Next card, we have Desecration Demon. So as flying at the beginning of your upkeep, if it deals beginning of your upkeep, each combat, any opponent may put a sacrifice creature and put a +1/+1 counter on Desecration Demon. And if so, oh sorry, I just kind of got distracted. And put a +1/+1 counter on it. So essentially, it's a 4 for a 6/6, and your opponent can answer it and make it tapped, but in turn will basically make it really big. We have one Elenda, the Dusk Rose. So essentially, it's a lifelink. Whenever another creature dies, it gets +1/+1 counter on it. And when she would die, you get X +1/+1 white vampire creature tokens with lifelink, where X is Elendra's power. So very great if she stacks up very much in terms of counters. You get a lot of X1/1 vampire tokens. Next, we have Murek Nightblade. So it's Outlast. So put a +1/+1 counter on it. Counter on this creature. And each creature with a +1/+1 counter will gain Death Touch. So very great for evasion because most opponents will not want to ram their creatures to block, if not possibly attack with, because they're threatened by, let's say you have a 1/1, they have a 6/6 Sun Titan, and they don't want to ram it to just get it killed. Next, we have one Twilight Prophet, a very good card out of Rivals of Ixalan. It's flying, Ascend, so if you have 10 counters, you get the City's Blessing. At the beginning of the upkeep, you can reveal the top card of your library. Your opponents lose the converted mana cost, and you just add it to your hand, and you gain that life. So very good. No drawbacks to that compared to Dark Confidant. There's no drawback. It's a little higher mana cost in terms of it's like one more black, one more colorless. But in terms of how easy it is to get the City's Blessing in an EDH game, it's very good for the long term. Next, we have Thalia, Heretic Cathar. First strike, so essentially creatures in non-basic lands your opponents control enter tapped. Very good early stalling method. I personally liked it. It annoys your opponents a lot because it prevents them from attacking the next turn because it prevents them from doing anything essentially, in terms of land base. Creatures they can't attack, even with haste they can't do anything with because it enters tapped, so it definitely stalls out your opponent. So one Champion Lambot, or Lambolt, or whatever, Lambot. Creatures with power less than the creatures of Champion of Lambot can't be blocked creatures you control. So whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you put a +1 counter on this card. So essentially, you stack this as many times you can. Your opponents cannot block this unless their creatures have more power than this card, and this card can stack very quickly. We have one Tyler's Tracker for the clues and draw power, along with buffing this guy up. We have Eternal Witness for the recursion ability for your graveyard. One Fiend Hunter for spot removal on a stick. We have one Anafenza Kintree Spirit, so you bolster essentially, put a +1 counter on the creature with the lowest toughness you control. So definitely buff up the creatures that you need. Essentially a good trigger effect that can stack onto other effects that give them another +1 counter. We have one Bloom Tender. We have one Una's Blackguard. So the great thing about this card is flying, and each other creature with a +1 counter on it deals damage to your opponent. Your opponent must discard a card. So you're really doing it for its second ability, not its first ability, but its second ability is great in terms of this deck. We have one Birds of Paradise and one Deathrite Shaman for different abilities. So in terms of mana ramp and exiling your opponent's graveyard, certain cards. Moving on to the enchantments, we have one Cathar's Crusade. Whenever a creature would enter the battlefield, you put a +1 counter on each creature you control. We have one Journey to Eternity. Enchanted creature you control. When an enchanted creature dies, return on the battlefield, and you essentially flip this card for another added bonus. We have one Hardening Scale, so whenever a +1 counter would be added to your a creature you control, you add an additional +1 counter, so definitely stacking more +1 counters very quickly. We have Authority of the Consul, so creatures your opponent controls enters the battlefield tapped, very stalling at your opponent. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, you gain 1 life. So there's no drawback for 1, and it's very, very good early game. Bad, maybe a little okay mid game, but terrible late game. We have one Aura Shards. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may destroy target artifact or enchantment. Very good in terms of spot removal for artifacts and enchantments you can't really take care of, and it's very easy to take care of with a creature alongside with Aura Shards. So we have one Mirai's Wake. Creatures you control get +1/+1, and every time you tap a land, you essentially add 1 more of that mana. We have one Oblivion Ring for another spot removal. One Rest in Peace for stopping your opponent's graveyard shenanigans. We have one Path of Discovery. So whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, it explores. So reveal the top card of your library, put that card into your hand. If it's a land, otherwise put a +1 counter on the creature. Then put the card back on top of your library, and then, or if not, put in your graveyard. And we have one Nature's Will. So whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to your opponent, you essentially tap all lands that player controls and untap all the lands you control. So it's a very good exchange. It's like Sword of Feast and Famine, except a lot better. It's like Vorinclex in a sense, but with a better added benefit of you can do it so many times, depending on how many creatures you have, how many opponents you have. Because if you can swing 3 separate creatures at your opponents, you can cast like instant sorceries, and then just kind of like go off before you attack, and then just untap everything just to cast more stuff during your main phase too. If that makes sense, guys. I don't know. But overall, we're going to artifacts. We have one The Immortal Sun. We have one Swiftfoot Boots. One Azor's Gateway. One Chromatic Lantern. One Mana Crypt. One Soul Rang. And one Sensei's Divining Top. Now, for most players that play EDH on a regular basis, you guys should know what these artifacts do, and the next sorceries should be very explanatory. We have one Cultivate, one Merciless Eviction, one Read the Bones, one Kodama's Reach, one Day of Judgment, one Tooth and Nail, one Triumph of the Hordes, one Nature's Will, and we have one Fumigate. Now, moving on to the land base, it's very self-explanatory. We have one Savannah. We have one Scrubland. We have one Bayou. We have one Marsh Flats. One Windswept Heaths. One Verdant Catacomb. One Godless Shrine. One Overgrown Tomb. One Temple Garden. One Brushland. One Temple of Malady. One Cave of Koilos, one Twilight Mire, one Wooded Bastion, one Command Tower, one Fetid Heath, one Command Beacon. We have one Woodland Cemetery, one Reliquary Tower, one Gavany Township, one Isolated Chapel, one Sun Petal Grove, one Landwar Wastes, one Temple of Plenty, one City of Brass, one Temple of Silence, one Vault of the Archangel. We have 3 plains, 3 forests, and 3 swamps. Now, the great thing about this mana base is it's pretty much complete. Fetch lands, shock lands, dual lands. So overall, the deck is complete. There's little things I like to tweak here and there for it, but overall, it's been performing really well. A very casual deck. Definitely can endure the grind. It's very mid-range kind of game. It ramps very quickly in terms of like mana base, but overall, it can stack very quickly. It can there's some hiccups here and there, and it can definitely miss here and there, but like definitely it depends on like what you can do. Before I forget, I totally missed over the instance. So we have one Path of Exile, one Anguish Unmaking, we have one Swords of Plowshare, one Absent Charm, one Naturalize, one Debt of Loyalty, one Tefari's Protection, and we have one Hero's Downfall. A lot of spot removal, protection for your own stuff, but overall, decks, as I was mentioning, deck is very grindy. It can definitely endure mid to late game. Early game depends on your opening hand. If you have mana base and some early creatures that really get your stack going, then it's great. If not, there's some things that you can play around with if you decide to go with the specific build. But overall, I built this deck to be more fun rather than competitive, depending as that is my play group styles in terms of playing. So let me know what you guys think. Like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. And yeah, hope you guys enjoyed it. Peace out.